Hi, this is Vanessa Gorman, and today I'm going to talk about the article and basic noun forms in ancient Greek, in particular the first and second declension nouns. I told you at the beginning of this course, if you're going to learn anything, you should learn the things that occur most frequently in Greek and that help you save time and effort as much as possible. Far and away, the most frequent word in Greek is the article. So learning this by heart, absolutely down cold, is perhaps the biggest thing you can do to help yourself learning Greek or any other language that has an article. There are only 24 forms. It's simple, it's straightforward, it'll save you countless time. Also, it's worthwhile to learn the basic noun endings because, again, there are not very many of them. It will save you a lot of time down the road. So with this in mind, I want to introduce you to the article and the basic nouns of the first and second declensions. Now, remember what we've already learned. Nouns, articles, adjectives, pronouns all have gender, number, and case. By gender, I mean masculine, feminine, or neuter, just like many languages today. By number, I generally mean singular or plural. There is a dual form, but we're not going to deal with it unless or until it comes up. It's pretty rare. Case in Greek means one of four things most of the time: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. We also get some vocatives, but those are direct address. So, oh, Athenians, how can you treat me this badly? Mostly in speeches. We're not going to be doing speeches right away, so we'll talk about them when we see them, but they're usually pretty obvious. Paradigms will be given in the order: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. That's pretty standard, separating the singular from the plural. So with that in mind, let's start by looking at the word the in the feminine. The feminine article, hey, right? An eta with a rough breathing. This paradigm you should learn in your sleep. You should be able to recite it like a mantra. The things to remember about articles are when they're in the nominative beginning with a vowel, they are proclitics. They lean forward, so they do not have an accent of their own. There's also always a iota subscript in the dative singular, no matter what the gender. There's a iota subscript here where the iota has gotten so weak that we don't pronounce it anyway. The other forms all have accents. You can see the feminine is what we call an alpha stem most of the time, but in the singular that becomes an eta stem. Etas and alphas aren't so far apart. The article doesn't change no matter what declension the noun is. What do I mean by that? Well, we have three noun declensions. And for example, here's three feminines in each of the declension. So you have he hemera, day, he hodos, road, and he polis, city-state. And the article is the same even though the noun endings change. So that means you're not always going to have the same form, even though you agree in number, gender, and case. Okay, an article has to agree with its noun in number, gender, and case, just like an adjective. It is, in a sense, a kind of adjective. Now, if you look at all of the articles, and again, this should be your mantra, you see certain similarities. So in the feminine, hey, taste, te, tain, high tone, tais, tas. In the masculine, ho, tu, to, ton, hoi, ton, tus, tois, tus. And in the neuter, to, tu, to, ta, ton, tois, ta. So a couple of things should stick out immediately. One is that the neuter masculine forms of the genitive and dative are the same, right? Tu and tu, tone and tone, toy, or toe and toe, toys and toys. The neuter differs from the masculine in the nominative and the accusative, but the neuter singular nominative and accusative are identical. The neuter plural nominative and accusative are identical. To and ta. So the neuter is like a simplified version of the masculine in a way. Dative singulars always have iota subscripts, whether te or to. Otherwise, the big difference is the masculine neuters have an omicron in the stem, whereas the feminines, the first declensions, have eta alpha stem. Now, something that is a little odd about Greek rather than say something like English is the article can actually be used without any noun. So we don't say the went down the road. We say the car went down the road. In Greek, they'll often use the article as a shortcut for a pronoun. So hi ephugon, ephugon means fled. Hi is just the feminine nominative plural article. And you can translate that perfectly well as they fled, as long as whoever the they is a feminine plural, and you know it from the context. So in one case, it might be hi stratiai ephugon, the armies fled. In another case, it might be the garrisons fled. Also, sometimes we can use it, especially when we have it paired up. So hi did this and hi did that, or hoy did this and hoy did that, meaning some people did this and others did that. And we'll see examples of that when we get into conjunctions. So, but most of the time, the article can be translated as a plain old pronoun if you don't have a noun expressed. Okay. Another example, ho ethuen, he was sacrificing. The ho is just the masculine singular nominative. So the he could be a citizen, it could be a soldier, it could be someone with a proper name, it could be all kinds of things. It just has to be masculine. And also another odd thing is that Greek regularly will use an article with a name. Now we do that very rarely, right? Like the city known as The Hague, right? They have the city known as the Piraeus, which is the harbor city of Athens, but they also do this with names a lot. You don't have to have the article with names, but they often do have the article with names. Sometimes it's very helpful for reasons we'll get into when we get a little further along, but most of the time you just ignore it in this situation. We don't say the Lysander, we say Lysander, okay? Now, that all said, remember that stems in nouns derive from the genitive singular. Now, frankly, in the first and second declensions, this doesn't matter as much. But in the third declension, this is going to matter an awful lot. So in the first declension, the nouns have what's called an alpha stem. And most of the time, they look just like the article, the endings do, or they have the alpha instead of the eta. In the case of agora, agoras, there's no difference in the stem between the nominative and the genitive, so that's not a problem. And by the way, most first declension nouns are in fact feminine. In the second declension, called the Omicron stem, mostly masculine and neuter, a very few feminines. And again, their nominative and genitive aren't very far apart. So demos in the nominative becomes demu in the genitive. So it's not really a problem figuring out what the stem is upon which to add the personal endings. However, and this is a big however, when you get to the third declension, all bets are off. This is sometimes called the consonant stem, even though some of them look like vowel stems. It's usually because some archaic consonant has dropped out, like a W sound, the digamma. And you can see, for example, hey nux, nuktos, you need to get the kappa tau of the dative to get your stem. Likewise, mace by itself gives you no clue that the rest of the word is built off the stem main. meaning month. Nuktos, of course, meaning night, nocturnal. Menos, that's where we get words like menstruation or things like that. Strateuma becomes strateumatos, so you would have no clue that you get an alpha tau stuck on the stem. So in the third declension especially, it's very, very important to see what the genitive singular form is, because that's going to give you the stem for the rest of the declension. This is why I've delayed talking about the third declension for a while. The first and second are easy peasy, straightforward. They each have, you know, a very limited number of endings, 8 in the feminine first declension, add a couple more if you add in the masculines that show up. And the same thing with the second, very, very few forms. So it's worth learning these. It really is, because you will save yourself a lot of time and energy if you do so. So, what do we see in the feminine? The first declension is mostly feminine. The plurals have the alpha in the stem. The singulars have alphas when the stem ends with epsilon, iota, or rho. So in this case, you have alphas throughout. The only place you don't is in the genitive plural, which is actually two vowels have glommed together into one and lengthened out into a long omicron. These vowels have contracted. There's the word I want. Always use the feminine article. And otherwise, if the stem doesn't end with epsilon, iota, or rho, you do get the eta in the singular that looks just like the article. So they become very easy to spot. Alphas and etas don't look that much apart. They're both tend to be that very similar long sound. So this shouldn't give you any trouble, but again, you should have this in your brain. Hey, mache, tes maches, te mache, te machen. This should be floating through your brain. There's also the note that accents on nouns are persistent, if you'll remember, so it tries to stay where it started. That means that the nominative plural ending, even though it looks like a long diphthong, the I of thalatai is actually a short sound, because we can keep the accent on the first syllable. Usually the genitive plural has a circumflex because we're contracting the alpha with an omega. And also, I just want to note, there's a couple of words that are really, really old words that in the Attic take a double tau, whereas in the other dialects of Greek, it takes a double sigma. And in fact, you'll probably find it in the dictionary under the double sigma. Thalata, meaning the sea. We get an English word, thalassocracy, meaning rule over the sea. People talk about whether Minos, King Minos of the Minotaur fame, had a thalassocracy or not. So there are just a couple of words like this where you'll get a double T instead of a double S. There's a lot of regional variation of dialects. We are sticking with the Attic Ionic for the most part, but you will see, if you read other authors like Herodotus, you will see weird spellings. So keep that in mind. First declension masculines, there are a few of these. You'll see them right away because they end with eta sigma instead of the eta, or alpha sigma instead of the alpha. Usually it's eta sigma. Again, you need the genitive singular here to know the gender, or else the article to know the gender. They are always modified by masculine articles because they are masculine. So this word polites, which means a citizen, is modified by the masculine article, even though once you get past the first two forms, first form looks like a feminine with a sigma stuck on it. The second form looks totally weird. It's, as you will see, the same form we'll see in the second declension. But the rest of it looks just like a standard first declension feminine, but it's not. It's a masculine. And there's only a handful of these. In fact, I'm only going to give you 5 that show up very often. And you'll know them pretty easily because they're all occupations. So, for example, we get the word harmostes, which is literally a harmost. It doesn't have to translate, but it's a governor. Hoplites, a hoplite soldier. Peltast, right? A peltast is someone who uses slings or arrows, right? Use the ancient artillery, light armored troops with slings and arrows. Polites, a citizen, derived from the word polis, city. And stratiotes is a soldier. We're getting a lot of these words with the strat base, you'll see, like from strategy. And that strat base always is a military prefix. So this should get you started on the first declension. I've limited the words to things occurring most often in Xenophon's Hellenica. And in fact, in the final column, you can see the count in the entirety of the Hellenica, which is 6 books. You can see how often it occurs. The red indicates the masculines, which I've already mentioned. And we're just going to concentrate on these 26 nouns of the first declension. Agora is the marketplace. We get the word agoraphobic from that. Harmost I talked about. Arche is rule or command. It originates from the word first. You have rule over someone in the genitive. And we get this in cognates, like monarchy, right? A cognate is a word with relatives. They're related words linguistically. They came from the same root at some point. So I like to get English cognates to help you remember ancient Greek words. Boule, there's no really common cognates that I can think of off the top of my head. For the council or the senate, the smaller body in the government, as opposed to the assembly, as you see down at number 7, the ecclesia, whence we get the word ecclesiastes or ecclesiastical, means of the assembly. Going back up to Gaia, land or earth, of course, this is the mother goddess Gaia, and we get the combining form geo, so geology, geography, any of those things. Irene is the word peace, which we get the English name Irene. Hemera is the word for day. You get the not terribly common word ephemeral, meaning something that only lasts for a day. I can't think of any cognates right offhand for hesuchia, to rest or leisure. The idiom will be I had hesuchia, meaning I shut up, I was quiet. Thalata, we already talked about. Mache, battle, we get lots and lots of words that are compounds of mach, verbs, nouns. You see the very next word, naumachia, meaning a sea battle, because now is the word we get nautical from. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Hoplites, we talked about. Peltastes, we talked about. Politeia is derived again from a third declension noun, polis, the city-state. So politeia, feminines often are the abstract nouns. Let me say it the other way. Abstract nouns are usually feminine. So politeia is the word for a constitution or an organization around a government. Polites, a citizen. Pule is a gate. Literally, it's one of the 2 gates. So usually it comes in the plural, like you came to the gates of a city. By the way, that's where we get the word pylon, where they funnel traffic down into a smaller area. A sponde is a truce. A stratia is an army. Again, we're going to see a lot of these strat words. Sumachia, right? We have mach meaning to fight. Sum is the preposition sun, right? As in symphony, and it means together. So if you are fighting together, you have an alliance, and hence the feminine abstract verb alliance. Philia, same thing. It comes from philos, meaning friend or friendly. So philia is friendship. Frura is a guard or garrison. Typically, the actual the idea of a unit more, whereas fulake, same thing, a guard or a garrison. And then hora, land or territory, has a lot of broad meanings. So these are the first declension nouns we're going to be using commonly. Second declension is not so different, as you know already from the article. It's mostly masculines with a few neuters. The endings look a lot like the first declension endings below there. You see I've given you mache as an example. It just, you have different vowel stem. An omicron stem instead of an alpha stem. So ho, theos, tu, theu, to, theo, ton, theon, hoi, theoi, ton, theon, tois, theois, tus, theus. Right? It shouldn't give you any problems. What about the neuter? Remember the rules about the neuter. They differ from the masculine in nominative and accusative, but the forms within the neuter are the same in the nominative and accusative, singular and plural. And so we get to in the singular and ta in the plural. And instead of ending with omicron sigma in the nominative, we get omicron nu. So to horion, meaning, again, a form of the land, the territory, which matches to horiu, to horio, matches the nominatives, endings, and articles, and then to horion again. So how do you tell a nominative from accusative? You have to distinguish them from context. That's the only way you can do it. Tas in the plural, that's usually the mark. Even in the third declension, you usually get a ta, an alpha in the nominative and accusative plural of a neuter, or sometimes an eta. So remember, they match in nominative and accusative. Otherwise, sorry, they match the masculine, that should say, not the nominative. Neuter plural subjects always take singular verbs. That's something we're going to get to. But if the subject is a neuter plural, it takes a singular verb. It's bad English, but it's good Greek. Okay. Collective nouns take singulars. It's more like British English. Also, there are very, very few second declension feminines. The most common one, the only one I'm going to give you right now, is hey hodos, road. If you think of an odometer, measures the road. The other most common one is probably Nasos island. Islands generally are feminine, just as cities are generally feminine, but not always. So again, I'm going to give you just a few second declension nouns. There's going to be 34 in all that occur more than 20 times in Xenophon's Hellenica. You can see the counts if you want to see which ones are most common. Adelphos, a brother, just as Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Anthropos, man. It can actually take a feminine article with the second declension endings and mean a woman sometimes. But of course, we get anthropology and things like that. Demos is an incredibly important word. It means the people. It also can mean the assembly. It can be when the people decide something, that means the assembly decides something. And of course, we get things like democracy from that. Ergon, work or deed, and neuter. So I've got it in red. Ergonomics, right? Ephoros is simply a Spartan official called an Epher, equivalent sort of to the Athenian archon. It's their chief magistrates, and they had 5 each year. So you're going to just see this word. You just transliterate it. Echthros is an enemy. Now, echthros is one of many words that are adjectives and they're nouns, which is to say, some of them I just ignore what's in the dictionary. Some of them the dictionary will agree with me. But essentially, the idea is if an adjective is used so often substantively, it's used with an article, ho echthros, the hostile guy, it becomes a noun at some point. And the question is, when does it stop being an adjective and start being a noun? I don't know. But if it's used that often, I will label it as a noun when it's used as a substantive because it just seems that there's not really any difference. We're going to see a few others like this as you go along. Xenos is one as well. But anyway, ekthros for the enemy, theos, a god, is theocracy or theology. Hippos, horse, my favorite way to remember that is the Greek word for a hippopotamus, right, is a nice Greek word, which means hippos, horse, potamos, river. So a hippopotamus is a river horse, just like a giraffe is actually a camel leopard. Logos is a very complicated word that can mean, at its basic, it's word. It comes from the word to speak. But it can mean the reason for something. It can mean the story. It can mean all kinds of things. So you have to be careful with that word because it's very nuanced. Misthos is pay. So if you pay your people, right, that's what you give them. Now archos, remember we had archos is a now is a, sorry, that arche we had as rule. An archos is an archon. A now archos is a ruler of a ship, and so therefore a ship's captain. And usually he paid for the ship each year. Necros is a corpse, so necrology. Nomos is another very nuanced word. Usually it means the law or the custom. Any of the words like economy, that nomi ending comes from nomos. It's the rule of oikos, a household. So oikos down there, a household gives you economy. It shortens through Latin to ECO. So oikos plus nomos equals economy, the household law or regulation, one might say. Xenos is either a foreigner, stranger, or someone with whom you have a special guest-friend relationship. So xenophobia means you're afraid of strangers. Hodos, we talked about already. Odometer will help you remember that. A road. Oikos, a household. Hoplon is armor. We get the word hoplite from this, armor or the shield. We also have, sorry, I repeated the hoplon there. Horkos, an oath. Pedion, field or plain, ultimately derives from the word pous, which means foot, right? So a flat thing, a field or a plain, just like pedzos, deriving the same way, means someone who goes on foot or an infantryman. Pistos is something that's trusted, epistemology. Actually, no, that comes from something else, so leave that alone. Polemarchos, again, an archos, an archon is a ruler. Arche is to rule. Polemos means war, if you go down 2 lines. So polemos means war. Polemios means an enemy. And again, this is a word that usually lists as an adjective, but it's used so often substantively that I will label it as a noun. And then the polemarch was an official at Athens who was supposed to be in charge of war. So he was sort of the chief general at Athens until the strategoi, number 27 there, the generals superseded him in power. And again, strategoi, that actually comes from strate, the idea of army, and then the verb ago, meaning to lead. So someone who leads the army is the general. Okay, going back up, sitos is grain, and notice I have it labeled masculine or neuter. It's usually masculine in the singular. It's often neuter, sita, in the plural. Stadion, stadios occurs either masculine or neuter. Usually it's neuter. And this is a stade. It's a distance of measure equivalent to about 200 meters. And the winner of the stade race at the Olympics always had great glory and got to name the 4-year period after him. So this was the most famous race. But it was also a nice unit of measure that you'll see quite often. Stratopedon, if you have an army on foot, it can mean army. Its normal meaning is an encampment, okay? But it can mean the army itself, and you just figure it out from context. Sumachos, again, a sumachia is an alliance, so a sumachos is someone who is part of that alliance. an ally. Tropion is where we get the English word trophy, and that's what it is. It's a trophy. If you beat the enemy, you usually take some of the spoils and pile up the armor you take off the enemy dead and pile it up as a trophy in honor of a god. Philos means friendly, but it's often used substantively, so much so that it means friend. So you can have it as an adjective or a noun. Fruros is a guard or garrison, unlike the feminine or or neuter if the that we've already seen, or I guess the feminines that we already have seen. This is the masculine, and it means the actual guard people, as opposed to the guard unit, which is the feminine. Chronos, time, chronology, of course, comes from that. And then chorion, land or territory, is not different much from chore. So there's nuances, but it's pretty much the same word. Okay, so there we are with the nouns I'm going to give you for now. And the nouns we're going to concentrate on for the immediate future. There aren't that many of them. They might be worth learning. I would think they'd be worth learning, especially the ones that occur the most often. You see sumachos occurs 172 times. That's often. Polemios 156 times. That's pretty often. Hoplon 77 times. That's pretty often. For each lesson in this unit, I will give you, at the end of each lesson, a number of practice sentences that use the grammar you've had so far. So far, all you're going to get are nouns and basic verbs, right? And what I do is I base these sentences on the Hellenica. I try to take them straight from the text, dropping out some words, but leaving everything else the same when I can. Now, that becomes easier when you've got more grammatical concepts under your belt. We're going to build on the same sentences so that what starts as just a noun and a verb, and a noun and a verb and an object, will start adding prepositional phrases and adverbs and all kinds of things. So I'm trying to base it off the text of the Hellenica wherever I can. And as we go along, it will become truer and truer to the text of the Hellenica. You should read the sentences I give you using Alphaeus. Turn Alphaeus on. So if you don't remember what a word means, click on it. It will tell you it. At least it will give you the basic meaning. You can go and look at the longer dictionary meaning if you want. It will give you one or more morphologies. You can choose between them as fits the sentence. And then I'll also link up to trees, grammatical trees, so you can see how the grammar functions to join all the words into a sentence. And this will become more important again as the sentences get more complicated. I will also give you commentary, and I will give you translations for everything in separate files. So give you hints at how to read it first. If you don't want to look at the translation, you can just look at the commentary. And then I also give you the full translation. These sentences are going to be divided up within the file, beginning with words using only the common vocabulary. So only the words on these charts and the words on the verb charts that I've given you. That doesn't mean you have to have it all memorized. You can use Alphaeus to click on a word and figure out the meaning at any time, right? Or to figure out the form. This is to help you remember. And then I'm also going to give you a section of sentences with some new vocabulary, mostly stuff you know, but a few words that you don't know necessarily, which you can practice reading using the analyzer, right? Use your tools. Look it up the easy way, because this is what you're going to do when you get into real text and the vocabulary isn't under strict control. So I want you to start feeling comfortable reading these things. I want you to practice as much as you choose. As we go along a little bit further, especially once we get past about prepositions, I'll start collecting a lot more sentences in each chapter, and you can do as few or as many of them as you like. It's just a question of practice, practice, practice until you feel proficient. So this is how each chapter will be structured, and you also will find anything in these charts will be on the website as a separate file you can download, so you can have a list of all the nouns and a list of all the verbs in their standard forms. So with that, let's go forward.